Following the trials, the assassination squad was led by Lieutenant Islambuli and Faraj, were tried, found guilty, sentenced to death by execution of firing squad in April 1982. For those who did not receive the death sentences, the remaining suspected dissidents had their time served and were released from prison by 1984, as was the case of Ayman al-Swahari. Several years before all of this, in December 1979, over 3,000 miles away from Egypt, in the Islamic country of Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded. Sheikh Abdullah Azzam, who's now an imam at King Abdullah's University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and issues a fatwa calling on all Muslims to come to Afghanistan's defense. Azzam had left Egypt, where he studied and taught at the Al-Azhar University from 1970 to 1973, where he obtained a PhD in Islamic jurisprudence, and then moved on to Jordan, where he taught at the University of Jordan in Amman, while lecturing at Abdulaziz University in Saudi Arabia. He was offered a teaching position at King Abdulaziz University in the spring semester of 1981. He then heard about the conflict in Afghanistan and was invited to Peshawar shortly after. More than anyone, it is Azzam who inspired Muslims, including the former student from the university, Osama bin Laden, to head to Afghanistan after 1981, who also saw this as an opportunity to profit by using his own money and machinery from his family's own construction company to help the resistance in the Soviet-Afghan War. And for the United States, as a Cold War moved to contain Soviet influence, the CIA under President Ronald Reagan funnels $3 billion to Muslim fighters repelling the Soviet invasion, who will famously become known as the Mujahedeen, for which on March 10, 1982, Reagan proclaimed it to be Afghanistan Day, dedicating the space shuttle launch to the Afghan Mujahedeen fighters.
I am dedicating on behalf of the American people the March 22nd launch of the Columbia to the people of Afghanistan.
Huzaifa is the son of Abdullah Azzam, recalled how he watched his father take the young Osama bin Laden under his wing.
My father saw in this movement a hope of bringing the Muslim world to the power again. I have lived with Osama bin Laden for more than 12 years, very close to him. At that time, Osama met my father as a teacher in the university.
An Algerian by the name of Abdullah Anas was studying to become an imam in his home country, where he heeded Azzam's call to jihad, arriving in Afghanistan in 1983 and eventually marrying one of his daughters, becoming a future son-in-law.
I was one of the the founders of the Services Bureau with Sheikh Abdullah Azzam. And in the same late 84, Osama bin Laden joined us as a founder also in the Services Bureau. He was from a rich family and he was able to spend all the expenditure of the office. When you talk about Zawahiri, it's another case. Zawahiri, when he came to Afghanistan, he came with his own idea from a struggle and rivalry between Jama'at al-Jihad, his jihadi group in Egypt, and Muslim Brotherhood. So they hate each other. So when he was released from jail and he came to Peshawar, he wasn't part of Services Bureau. He wasn't part with Sheikh Abdullah Azzam and bin Laden and us. His priority, how to protect people here not to follow the Muslim Brotherhood. And that as a consequence, not to follow Abdullah Azzam, because automatically he will lead them to Muslim Brotherhood. This is just what he was in his mind. It's not true. But I think he was completely paranoid by what happened to Egypt between him, rivalry between Muslim Brotherhood and the jihadi group. And he brought that struggle to Peshawar, which doesn't exist.
By this time in 1984, Azzam is now in Peshawar on the Afghanistan border, where he runs a charity for Afghan refugees while also organizing Muslim recruits eager to join the battle against the Soviets. Their recruitment efforts include a monthly magazine, Al-Jihad.
If we send the Al-Jihad magazine, spread it to the universities of United States or the Islamic centers, because, you know, it was a resource of helping money for Afghanistan. But the main one was in the Brooklyn.
Azzam would eventually take a break from the war in 1988, touring the United States, preaching at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn and other recruitment facilities throughout the states, raising money and preaching jihad.
Oh, brothers, after Afghanistan, nothing in the world is impossible for us anymore. There are no superpowers or mini powers. What matters is the willpower that springs from our religious belief. The world today is arbitrarily ruled by Jews and Christians. The Americans, the British, and others. And behind them, the fingers of international Jewry with their wealth and their women and their media.
The Al-Khifa Refugee Center, also known as the Maktab al-Khidmat, also known as the Afghan Services Bureau, set up an elaborate support and recruitment network coast to coast with branches in more than 38 American cities, originally starting in Phoenix, Arizona. These centers became clearinghouses and recruiting offices to support the jihad in Afghanistan and eventually around the world.
And they were working legally. Their job only is to gather the funds and to get the supports from the people living in the state.
But in the early coming year that followed the Soviets' withdrawal of Afghanistan, marking what will become the end of the Soviet-Afghan War, consequently, the Soviet Union disintegrating as the world enters the post-Cold War era, with East and West Germany unification beginning as the wall collapses and as the Baltic states break up and what is described as the revolutions of 1989. But Afghanistan rapidly sinks into civil war and utter chaos as the United States begins to withdraw its support with the Mujahedeen since Soviet-Afghan War has ended, as the unintended consequence of blowback will eventually arise years later.
By the 89, 90, the number reached maybe 4,000 Arabs and Muslims. So it goes up. Until that time, till 88, Osama bin Laden and Sheikh Abdullah Azzam and all of us, as a former founders of Services Bureau, we worked together. But something, Osama split himself to us in late 88, and he joined a group called Jama'atul Jihad, Jihadi group, Egyptians, and they were there, some names like Zawahiri, like somebody called Sayyid Imam, Abul Fadl, and a group. They were not part of jihad in Afghanistan. They were just part in Peshawar for their own agenda. No one knows because they were very minority. No one knows what they are doing there. And they start working, and then they joined to Osama bin Laden. They became a group, and later on they called what we know today Al-Qaeda.
But in early 1989, an attempt on Azzam's life failed when a lethal amount of TNT explosive placed beneath the pulpit from which he delivered the sermon every Friday failed to detonate. It was said that if the bomb exploded, it would have destroyed the mosque and killed everybody inside it. But his fate would soon catch up to him by November 1989, as Abdullah Azzam was driving to a mosque in Peshawar, Pakistan, with two of his sons. A car bomb explodes, killing them instantly. The murder was never solved, but his death made him a martyr to radical Muslims around the world. With Azzam gone, bin Laden, who had already split from the Maktab al-Khidmat, returning home to Saudi Arabia, hailed as a hero after the war, eventually reorganizes the jihad network around him.